Hello, Hot Rodders and car enthusiasts. I'm Hot Rod Bob, and you've got Gas, the morning edition, coming to you live from beautiful downtown Oxnard, high above, well, really, it's not high above anything, but we're here. This is Gas, the Great American Auto Scene. And, one of the things people think about is performance, or at least car guys think about, and gals think about performance. I want you to think about something. The Ford Flathead V8, 1932 through 1954. But what year did Ford produce their first overhead valve V8 engine? Think about that for a second. How many of you say 54? Raise your hand. I'm not raising my hand. I know better. That's right. I know better because the first Ford overhead valve V8 was actually 1952. Now, although it is similar to the Y block that Ford put in their general cars beginning in 1954, Lincoln actually got the first overhead valve V8 produced by the Ford Motor Company in 1952. Now, nothing is interchangeable between that engine and the engine that appeared in the Ford beginning in 1954, but it's an amazing engine in itself. Now, it has the basic Y block architecture for the way the block comes down, kind of encompassing the crankshaft. That's where the Y block became very popular because it was very strong at the lower end. Now, the first Lincoln V8 came out in 1952, as I said. It did not share anything with the Ford Y block we saw in 1954. It had more horsepower. It had totally different architecture. Now, the first one started out at 317 cubic inches. Huge in comparison to Ford 239 that came out in 1954. So it was big. Now, it later on increased to 341 in 55, 368 in 56, and 279 and 302 and 332 versions from 52 to 63. Now, this architecture, the Lincoln architecture, was unique in that it did not share, as I said, with the Ford version, but it was also the engine in the Mercuries later on and later in trucks. It was big. It was powerful. In 317 cubic inch form, it had 160 horsepower, far more than the Ford's first overhead valve V8 Y block in the Fords and 1954 Mercuries as well. Now, the Mercury engine was 256 cubic inches, while the Ford was 239. Those were basic Y blocks as we know them. We don't think about the Lincoln back then, but the Lincoln was kind of a Y block, as I said. The casting for the block was the same. That's the only thing they had in common. Now, these were big engines. They were torquey engines. They appeared in the Lincoln, and they were so good, Lincoln won the Pan American race in Mexico 3 years in a row in the stock class. They had some horsepower. They had some torque. They had reliability, and they worked. Lincoln, not the Continental yet, but the regular Lincolns won the Pan American race, the Mexican road race, I guess you could call it. So for 1957, they bumped the size up to 368 cubic inches. This thing was big. Now, why this engine didn't get the notice of hot rodders back in the day, I'm not quite sure, only because it said Lincoln, although some of the hot rodders did gravitate to the Oldsmobiles and the Cadillacs beginning in 1951, I believe it is, or 49, when they came out with the V8. But the Lincoln just kind of went unnoticed. Now, there was an M version, 335, that was homologated into the Mercuries for stock car racing back in the day. And it boasted an Isky cam, 2 4-barrel carburetors, and a conservative rating of 335 horsepower. Interesting for the time. That's a lot of horsepower for 1957, and that was not fuel injected. You got to remember, Chevrolet had the fuel injection in 57. I believe Pontiac got it in 58, or maybe 57 as well. But the Lincoln, man, it had some horsepower and torque, but it was a big engine. Physically, it was huge, and that made it difficult for hot rodders to utilize. Now, in 1956, they put it in, or 55, they put it in the Lincoln Continental for 55 and 56. Now, this engine was dressed up to look better. It had cast aluminum valve covers that are hard to find today and really coveted by those who get them. And I believe they do fit on the Y block in general. But the Y block, as we know it, Ford had nothing in common with the Lincoln. The Lincoln was cool. And Curtis is telling me the 57 Pontiac had mechanical fuel injection on the 347. I knew it was one of those years. I just remember which. And I do remember seeing it on the side, a badge on the side of the 58 Bonneville that comes out to the cruise nights here every once in a while. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Happy 427 Day, Dar. And 426 Day was yesterday. Come on, Dar, you got to catch up with things here. It's a 427 Day. But we're talking about the Lincoln motor. It was a variant of the Y block. It came out before the Ford Y block that everyone associates with Thunderbird and 54 Fords and even the Mercuries at the time. It's a different engine, tons of horsepower. Now, I'll give you an example. In 1956, the intake and exhaust valve diameters were opened up to 2 inches and 1.64. And its breathing was so great, the engine produced 300 horsepower at 4,800 RPM, 415 pounds of torque. Man, this thing was a strong engine. Why it didn't end up at more hot rods and more race cars at the time, I don't know, other than maybe the speed equipment manufacturers didn't step up for it because, well, it was a Lincoln. Why are we going to build speed equipment for a Lincoln? Who's going to modify a Lincoln? True. And really, there was only a handful that did get modified. But why the engine didn't find its way into street rods and hot rods, or not street rods at the time, and drag cars because of the amount of power, don't know, other than the lack of support from the speed equipment industry. So the first Y block, which kind of was a Y block, was a Lincoln in 1952. Ahead of its time for Ford. Ford didn't put a Y block in until 1954. The Y block stayed in production through 1960s as a truck engine. It was in the cars in various stages, but in 1958, Ford came up with the FE motors, 352, 390, 406, 427, 428, I believe, and on, but those were later on. The Y block, very stout engine. Biggest problem they had, if I remember correctly from my experience, was the early oils didn't have enough detergent in them, and the rocker arms, which were on a shaft, I believe, at that time, weren't getting proper oiling. A lot of the fixes were you ran a line from the block up to the valve cover so it sprayed on the valves or the rocker arm assemblies. So, that's the history. Ford overhead valve V8s, not just with the Ford. The Lincoln stepped up before main Ford production. I'm Hot Rod Bob. You've got Gas, a morning edition. Thanks for tuning in. You are a gasaholic. And Pete Muriello, you definitely are. And Natalie's saying her husband's got a completely restored 68 Mustang. Cool vehicles, especially back in the East Coast where you are. That's a tough one to hang on to. You have a great day, everybody. I'm Hot Rod Bob. You've got Gas. And we're brought to you by Valley Head Service Tech Equipment, where you can get all the equipment you need for the shop you've got there in Simi Valley, California. Irwindale Drag Strip and Speedway, and I'm headed there today. We're racing tonight. Street drags at Irwindale Drag Strip. And some of you may have noticed on Facebook, I'm going to be the official announcer for Hot August Nights drag racing coming up in August in Reno, California. Hope to see some of you there. And I'm going to enjoy it. I hope you enjoy Gas, the Great American Auto Scene. Thanks for being a gasaholic. I'm Hot Rod Bob. You've got Gas.